The moment Mara's father approaches the small house, everything she has built with Otavio is about to fall apart. Will true love be strong enough to stand up to Elio's fury, or will Mara be forced to return to the life she despises so much? Mara grew up surrounded by luxury that few could imagine. The mansion where she lived with her family was imposing, with marble walls and crystal chandeliers that sparkled in the sunlight. But for her, all that splendor seemed empty. As much as others saw a perfect life, Mara knew that the true brilliance of her home was limited to expensive objects and social events. Inside those walls, what was really missing was the warmth of a close-knit family. Ever since she was little, Mara felt that she didn't belong in that world. Her father, Elio, a successful and influential businessman, always valued appearance and perfection. For him, his two eldest daughters, Letitia and Bruna, were the ideal example of how someone should be. Letitia was beautiful and elegant, always ready to appear at events and receive compliments. Bruna, the middle sister, wasn't far behind. She followed in Letitia's footsteps with dedication, receiving the same attention from her father. But Mara was different. She didn't have the conventional beauty of her sisters, nor the willingness to follow the standards demanded by Elio. From a very young age, Mara already noticed her father's disapproving looks and whispers of comparison. He didn't hide his displeasure. "You'll never be like your sisters," he said in a cold, cutting tone. Elio's words were heavy, and over time Mara stopped struggling to please him. The constant rejection drove her further away. Mara was always looking for a place where she could feel useful and valued, something she couldn't find at home. While her sisters attended parties and showed off their expensive clothes, Mara took refuge in activities that warmed her heart. She would spend hours at the local orphanage, helping the children read or simply listening to their stories. There, Mara felt a peace that didn't exist in her own home. However, even her good deeds didn't escape Helio's critical eye. He saw Mara's involvement with the children as a waste of time. "Why do you spend your time with these people?" he asked, with obvious contempt. For him, people's value lay in their social position, and the fact that Mara devoted so much time to those who had little only reinforced, in his eyes, that she wasn't up to being his daughter. Mara, however, was no longer shaken. Every time she went out to help at the orphanage, she felt a little hope reborn in her heart. It was her way of resisting isolation and the feeling of rejection. She knew that, despite the coldness she faced at home, her value lay in something that Helio would never be able to understand. Even so, the weight of being constantly ignored and despised by the person who was supposed to love her was suffocating. One night, after a bitter argument with Elio, Mara locked herself in her room. Silent tears streamed down her face as she stared at the ceiling. She knew that, no matter how hard she tried, she would never be accepted by her father as Letitia and Bruna were. But inside her, a silent flame began to grow. It was a feeling of revolt and, at the same time, determination. Mara began to realize that she didn't need Elio's approval to find her place in the world. Little by little, the idea of following a different path, far from the shadow of perfection that her father demanded, became stronger. That night was decisive for Mara. Lying in her bed, she promised herself that one day she would find her own place in the world. A place where she could be valued for who she really was, and not for appearances. Even if that meant completely breaking with her family and everything she knew. What Mara didn't yet know was that the strength born in her heart would change her life forever. The world she knew was about to crumble, and with it, the certainties of everyone around her. Something was about to happen, something that would defy everyone's expectations and test her courage and her ability to free herself from the bonds imposed by her family. The next morning, Mara woke up with a different feeling. Something had changed inside her. The orphanage, where she spent most of her days, seemed even more welcoming. It was there, among the children who welcomed her with smiles, that she felt at peace. But that day would be different. There was something in the air, a feeling that her fate was about to change. Mara always knew that she would never live up to her father's expectations. From a very young age, she noticed how differently Elio treated Letitia and Bruna, with pride and admiration. For him, they were both perfect daughters. Letitia, the eldest, was stunningly beautiful and always knew how to behave at the parties and events that Elio organized. Bruna, on the other hand, was just as beautiful as Letitia and shared her taste for elegant clothes, jewelry, and the fake smiles that were distributed at high society gatherings. Mara, however, was different. She didn't have the same interest in lavish parties or the constant need for approval from others. She preferred to spend her afternoons reading or spending time at the orphanage, where she felt more useful. But this difference in Elio's eyes was almost an offense. He couldn't understand why Mara didn't follow the same path as her sisters. "Why can't you be like them?" he would ask in a stern tone every time he saw Mara in simple clothes, without makeup, looking like she didn't belong in the glittering world he held so dear. With each comment, Mara withdrew further. She knew that, no matter how hard she tried, she would never be able to please Elio. The constant comparison with Letitia and Bruno weighed like an invisible chain on her shoulders. When she was a child, Mara even tried to look different. Sometimes she wore the expensive clothes her mother bought her, wore the lipstick Letitia loved, but she never felt comfortable. Parties were a torment. The empty conversations and judgmental looks made Mara feel even more isolated. Soon, she gave up trying to fit in. Letitia and Bruna always stood out. They both liked to be the center of attention. They were beautiful and they knew it. Letitia, with her blonde hair and blue eyes, was constantly praised for her impeccable appearance. Bruna, with her natural charm, completed the duo that Elio praised so much. When the three sisters were together, it was impossible not to notice the contrast. While Letitia and Bruna shone in expensive dresses and rehearsed smiles, Mara remained silent on the sidelines, observing everything with a mixture of sadness and resignation. Praise for Letitia and Bruna came from everywhere. At parties, Elio's friends didn't hide their admiration for his older daughters. "What beauties," they said. "You must be proud, Elio." And he, of course, nodded with a satisfied smile. But when he looked at Mara, there was only indifference. "Oh, is that the other daughter?" some asked, without much curiosity. For many, Mara was a dull shadow, an almost imperceptible presence. Elio couldn't hide his discontent. He demanded perfection, and Mara, in his eyes, was anything but. On several occasions, he made a point of highlighting the difference between Mara and her sisters. "Look at Letitia and Bruna," he would say. "They know what they want, they know how to behave. You..." The sentence was never completed, but the tone of disdain was enough for Mara to know exactly what he was thinking. For Elio, Mara was a disappointment, and he didn't make a point of hiding it. Over time, Mara learned to accept the indifference of her father and sisters. She stopped trying to be like them, stopped craving the praise and attention she knew would never come. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't help but feel a deep pain every time Elio praised Letitia or Bruna, or when he ignored her completely. It wasn't easy living in the shadow of her sisters, knowing that she was a stranger to her own father. Once, during a party at the mansion, Mara tried to blend in with the guests. Letitia and Bruna were laughing and dancing, surrounded by people who adored them. Elio, on the other side of the hall, was chatting to some business colleagues, casting approving glances at his older daughters. Mara, in a corner, watched the scene in silence. She didn't fit in. She knew it. The emptiness she felt in that environment made her question why she was still trying. That night, something changed inside Mara. As the laughter and music filled the room, she discreetly went out into the garden. She sat down on a stone bench and looked up at the stars. For the first time, she felt that she no longer needed to force herself to be something she wasn't. The weight of appearances, of comparisons, was gone. The weight of appearances, comparisons, and expectations was finally beginning to dissipate. Alone in the garden, away from the music and the muffled voices of the party, Mara felt a lightness she hadn't experienced for a long time. She looked at the trees around her, at the vastness of the sky, and realized that the life she wanted wasn't there, in that house, at that party. She wanted more. She wanted to find a place where she could be herself, without the constraints of appearances that her family valued so much. With that silent decision, Mara got up and went back to the mansion, but something inside her had changed forever. From that moment on, she knew she would start looking for a different path, one where she could live away from the suffocating expectations of Helio and the society that surrounded him. Mara's days became lonelier as time went by. While Letitia and Bruna continued their routines of parties and social events, Mara became increasingly distant from the life her family considered ideal. Her only real escape was the orphanage, a place she visited often. There, she found something that was missing in her own home: human warmth, the simplicity of the children, and, above all, the peace she so longed for. One day, Mara arrived at the orphanage as usual, carrying books and some sweets for the children. As soon as she entered, she felt the usual relief when she saw the smiling faces waiting for her. The children ran to hug her, shouting her name, and this warmed her heart. But that day would be different, although she didn't know it yet. While helping the children with their reading, Mara noticed a man in the orphanage office, talking to the director. He was tall, with brown hair, and wore simple but elegant clothes. Mara didn't remember seeing him before. Curious, she continued to watch from afar, but soon turned her attention to the little ones around her, asking for her help. Later, as she was putting her books away and preparing to leave, the orphanage director approached her. "Mara, I'd like to introduce you to someone," said the director with a kind smile. "This is Otavio. He helps us with the orphanage's accounts." Otavio held out his hand and smiled in a friendly way. "It's a pleasure to meet you," he said. "I've heard a lot about the work you do here." Mara, a little surprised, shook his hand and smiled back, still not knowing what to say. "It's good to know that you're helping the orphanage," she replied, trying to be cordial, but still suspicious of how someone connected to her father's financial world could be there, in a place so far removed from Elio's concerns. Over the next few days, Mara began to notice Otavio's constant presence at the orphanage. He was involved in the accounting projects, helped with the organization, and occasionally talked to the children. Although his role was administrative, he seemed genuinely interested in the well-being of the place. Mara, however, remained a little distant, watching him from a distance, without fully understanding his intentions. One afternoon, when she was about to leave, Otavio approached her. "Can I walk you to the gate?" he asked politely. Mara hesitated for a moment, but eventually agreed. As they walked through the garden that led to the exit gate, he began to chat in an unpretentious way. "How long have you been coming here?" he asked, looking at the trees that swayed gently in the wind. "For a few years now," replied Mara, without much enthusiasm. "I like spending time here. I feel at peace." Otavio nodded and, for a moment, remained silent, as if choosing his words carefully. "It's rare to find someone like you," he said at last. "Someone who isn't just fulfilling an obligation, but really cares about these children." Mara was surprised by the comment. She was used to the cold, calculating words of her family, where everything had a practical purpose. "I do it because I like it," she said simply. Over the next few days, Otavio continued to get closer to Mara. With each conversation, she realized that he wasn't like the businessman she knew. He didn't talk about numbers, profits, or power. On the contrary, he seemed fascinated by the simple things in life, the smiles of children, the nature around him. That intrigued Mara. One afternoon, while the two of them were chatting on a bench in the garden, Otavio finally revealed a little more about himself. "My life hasn't been easy either," he said, looking up at the sky. "I came from a humble family. I've always had to fight for every opportunity. I'm not like the people you're probably used to living with." Mara looked at him in surprise. He spoke with an honesty she hadn't expected. "You seem to be comfortable with who you are," she replied, not knowing quite what to say. Otavio smiled slightly. "I think I've learned to accept myself as I am," he said quietly, "but I'm still trying to understand the world around me. And in the process, I realize that what really matters isn't money or status. It's something deeper." Mara felt touched by those words. For the first time, she felt like she was talking to someone who understood her, someone who saw the world the same way she did. The two continued talking, sharing stories about their lives. Mara talked about the coldness of her home, the distance from her father, and the pressures of living in such a strict family. Otavio, on the other hand, talked about how he fought to earn his place, always maintaining his values and principles. As the days went by, the connection between Mara and Otavio grew. They saw each other more and more at the orphanage, and their conversations became deeper. Mara felt a peace she hadn't experienced for a long time. For the first time, someone seemed to see her beyond appearances, beyond the millionaire's daughter image that everyone imposed on her. But deep down, Mara knew that her relationship with Otavio would not be accepted by her family. Elio would never understand the value that Mara saw in Otavio. And so, despite the happiness she felt at his side, a shadow of uncertainty began to hang over them both. Mara knew that, sooner or later, she would have to face the consequences of her choices. Mara and Otavio's meetings at the orphanage became more and more frequent. What began as casual conversations about the children and volunteer work evolved into something deeper. Mara felt at ease with Otavio in a way she had never experienced before. He didn't seem to expect anything from her, just her company and sincerity. This disconcerted her and, at the same time, attracted her. One day, while they were walking through the orphanage garden, Otavio looked at her in a different way. "Have you ever thought about leaving all this behind?" he asked suddenly. Mara stopped and stared at him, surprised by the question. "Leave what behind?" she replied, with a slight hesitation. "Your life, your family. Everything you don't seem to fit into." Mara was silent for a moment. She had thought about it countless times, but hearing these words spoken out loud, by someone who was beginning to matter to her, made the idea even more real. "I've thought about it, but it's not that simple," she said, looking down at the floor. "Leaving my family? Even with everything, they're still my family." Otavio nodded, understanding. "I understand. But you deserve to be happy, Mara. You deserve to find a place where you feel free, where you can be yourself, without the weight of other people's expectations." His words echoed inside her, like a whisper she couldn't ignore. She knew he was right. Elio and her sisters had always seen her as someone who didn't fit in, and she had spent so long trying to please them, without success. But what if she stopped trying? What if, for the first time, she went her own way? The days went by and Mara and Otavio's relationship continued to grow. They would talk for hours about their lives, dreams, and frustrations. Mara felt that she could be real with him. She didn't have to pretend or hide her feelings. Otavio, for his part, admired Mara's inner strength, even if she didn't realize how resilient she was. During a quiet afternoon at the orphanage, Otavio made a comment that made Mara think even more. "You're much stronger than you think. You know that?" Mara smiled, without much conviction. "I don't feel that way. Sometimes I think I'm just dragging myself through life." Otavio shook his head in disagreement. "You live in a world that doesn't value you, and yet you remain true to who you are. That takes a strength that many people don't have." Mara had never thought of it like that. For her, it was just a question of emotional survival. But when Otavio put it that way, she began to see that perhaps, in fact, she had a strength that she had never recognized. And that strength, although silent, was what kept her going, despite all the contempt she faced within her own home. Over time, the attraction between the two became more evident. It wasn't just a friendly connection, but something deeper. In a moment of distraction, during a conversation in the shade of the trees, Otavio held Mara's hand. She looked at him in surprise, but didn't pull her hand away. There was something there, a mutual understanding, a sense of belonging that Mara had never experienced before. Otavio looked her in the eye and, for the first time, said something she knew to be true but was afraid to admit. "I care about you, Mara. I really do." The words, simple and direct, touched Mara's heart. She had never heard anything like it, said so sincerely. Her family had always treated her with detachment and, outside the orphanage, Mara had never really felt important to anyone. But there, with Otavio, she felt that she was seen, heard, and, above all, valued for who she really was. Mara, however, couldn't help the fear that began to creep in. She knew that if her father found out about Octavian, the consequences would be severe. Elio would never accept his daughter, even the one he despised, getting involved with someone like Otavio, a man with no fortune or status. What would she do then? Continuing with this relationship meant directly defying her father and everything his family stood for. But the thought of giving up Octavian also haunted her. He was the first person she felt truly connected to. To give that up would be to give up her own chance of happiness. And Mara wasn't willing to go back to the empty life she led before she met him. That night, alone in her room, Mara reflected on everything that was happening. She knew that her relationship with Otavio would bring challenges she hadn't faced before, but at the same time, she felt she could no longer deny what was being born between them. For the first time, Mara began to think about what a life away from her family could be like, away from the ties that had always bound her. Doubt, however, still ate away at her. Would she be able to break away from everything she knew? What if Otavio wasn't ready to face the consequences of being together? Mara knew that the choice she would make over the next few days could change everything. And while the world around her seemed to continue at its usual pace, Mara sensed that something big was about to happen. Mara spent days thinking about Otavio's words and the possibility of a different life. Each time he mentioned how she deserved more than the invisible chains that bound her, her heart was filled with hope, but also with fear. She knew that to be truly happy, she would have to make a decision that would change her life forever. At home, the pressure only increased. Elio, as always, praised Letitia and Bruna's achievements. The two continued to shine at social events, parties, and in every environment they frequented. Mara, on the other hand, found herself increasingly distant from that world. She felt that she no longer belonged there. The more she talked to Otavio, the clearer it became that she wanted to escape from that suffocating environment. One evening, after yet another dinner where she had been ignored by Elio and his sisters, Mara decided it was time to make a choice. She couldn't go on living in the shadow of her father's expectations, always feeling inadequate. She wanted something more, something that would make her feel truly alive. And Otavio was the only person who could make that happen. The next day, Mara met Otavio at the orphanage and decided to open her heart. "Otavio," she began, her voice firm but full of emotion, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About leaving all this behind. I want to try." Otavio looked at her with surprise, but also with a twinkle in his eye. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice soft and full of understanding. "I don't want you to feel pressured into doing something you don't want to." Mara shook her head, determined. "I do. For the first time, I feel like I can be truly happy. But I need to know that you're with me on this." Otavio held Mara's hands and looked deep into her eyes. "I'll always be by your side," he said sincerely. "I love you, Mara, and if you want to follow this path, I'll be with you." His words filled Mara's heart with courage. For the first time, someone loved her for who she really was, without demands, without unrealistic expectations. She knew that, alongside Otavio, she could build a different life, one that wasn't tied to appearances and the status of her family. They began to plan their escape. They didn't want to do anything rash, but they knew that if they were discovered, Elio would react strongly. Mara could already imagine what her father would do. He would threaten, manipulate, and perhaps even use his power to try to destroy Otavio. She knew Elio's temper well and knew that he wouldn't take this decision lightly. Despite this, Mara stood firm. She knew that, in order to be happy, she had to take this risk. Over the next few weeks, they planned every detail carefully. They decided that the wedding would be the first step. They wanted something simple, away from the eyes of society and, above all, away from Elio's control. Otavio suggested a small chapel in a remote village where few people knew them. It would be an intimate ceremony, with just a few people who really cared about them. For Mara, the important thing was not the grandeur of the event, but the meaning behind it. The freedom to choose her own life, to build something alongside someone who truly loved her. As the plans took shape, Mara couldn't help the fear that was growing inside her. She knew that once she took this step, there would be no turning back. Breaking up with her family meant giving up everything she knew. Comfort, financial security and, however fragile, the relationship she had with her sisters. Letitia and Bruna had always been distant, but they were still her family. Would she be able to bear this breakup? Otavio, sensing Mara's anguish, comforted her. "I know it won't be easy," he said one evening when they were sitting on the balcony of the orphanage. "But I promise that, together, we'll get through anything." Mara wanted to believe that, and deep down, she did. But Elio's voice, always present in her mind, tormented her with implicit threats. "You'll never be able to survive without us," he always said. "What would you do without all this comfort? You don't know what it's like to live without luxury." These words echoed in his mind, but now they seemed less strong. Alongside Otavio, Mara began to understand that the value of a life was not in material goods, but in true connections and simple moments of happiness. With each passing day, she felt that she was getting closer to finding what she was really looking for. Finally, the day of their escape was at hand. They chose a weekend when Elio and his sisters would be away at a business event. Everything was ready. The discreetly packed suitcases, the simple dress Mara would wear to the wedding, and the promise of a new life. Mara knew that what was about to happen would be the turning point in her life. There was no turning back. The night before the elopement, Mara looked at her house for the last time. She knew that when she crossed that threshold the next morning, she would be leaving behind not just a house, but a lifetime of expectations, rejections, and hurt. The future was uncertain, but for the first time Mara felt she had control over what lay ahead. The day that Mara and Otavio had planned finally arrived. The morning sun gently illuminated the windows of the orphanage as Mara prepared to take the biggest step of her life. Beside her, a discreet suitcase, a simple dress, and the certainty that she was about to change the course of her story. There was no glamour or luxury in what they were about to do, but that hardly mattered. The most important thing was the meaning behind the wedding. The freedom Mara had longed for and the chance to be happy with Otavio. Mara felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement as she looked in the mirror. She put on the simple white dress that Otavio had lovingly chosen. It wasn't made of expensive silk, nor was it adorned with jewels, but it represented the simple and true life they were about to build. The ceremony would be small, away from the prying eyes of society and, most importantly, away from Helio's suffocating control. As Mara adjusted the last details of her dress, she felt a wave of emotion. It was the first time she had made such an important decision without the influence of her father or sisters. For the first time, her life would be guided by her own choices, by what she truly believed in. "I'm ready," she thought, taking a deep breath. Otavio was waiting for her outside the entrance to the orphanage, dressed simply but elegantly. When Mara came out and saw him, her heart raced. He was there, smiling, ready to start a new life with her. The love in Otavio's eyes reassured her that she was on the right track. "You look beautiful," he said, holding her hands tenderly. "Thank you," replied Mara, feeling tears gathering in her eyes. "I can't believe we're finally doing this." Otavio smiled. "We deserve it. Let's be happy, Mara. Away from everything that hurts you. Away from your father's control. Let's build our own life." The two of them drove to the small village where the ceremony was to take place. The chapel was simple, surrounded by trees and wildflowers. The place seemed isolated from the rest of the world, as if it had been chosen especially for them. Only a few close friends were waiting for them. The silence of the surrounding nature made the moment even more special. There, in that small space, Mara felt that she was finally free of all the expectations and pressures that had haunted her all her life. As she entered the chapel, Mara felt calm take over her body. The atmosphere was welcoming, and the soft light coming through the windows gave the moment a touch of serenity. As she walked down the aisle next to Otavio, she realized that she didn't need anything else. She didn't need lavish parties, expensive jewelry, or the approval of people who didn't really know her. All she needed was there. Otavio's sincere love and the freedom to be who she really was. The small group of friends present smiled as the two approached the altar. The priest, an elderly man with a gentle expression, was waiting for them with a calm look on his face. "We are here today to celebrate the union of two souls who have found and loved the strength to follow a new path," he said, in a low but firm voice. As the priest spoke, Mara felt lighter with every word. The promises that Otavio had made to her over the weeks became even more real at that moment. There, in front of everyone, he promised her a simple life, but one full of love and companionship. And that was exactly what Mara wanted. She wasn't looking for riches, status, or recognition. What she wanted most was to be loved and valued for who she was, not for what she was expected to be. When it came time for the vows, Otavio looked deeply into Mara's eyes. "I love you, Mara," he began. "From the day I met you, I knew you were different. I saw a kindness in you that few people see, and it's that goodness that makes me want to be by your side every day. I promise to love and support you no matter what. Together, we will build a life far removed from everything that has made you suffer. A life where we'll be happy, simple, and true." Otavio's words touched Mara's heart deeply. She couldn't hold back the tears that streamed down her face. When it was her turn to speak, Mara took a deep breath and said, her voice choked with emotion, "I love you too, Otavio. You showed me that life can be more than just following rules and expectations. With you, I learned to value the simple things, the importance of being true to myself. I promise to be your companion in every moment. Together, we'll create the life we've always dreamed of." As they exchanged rings, Mara felt the weight of the decisions she was making, but also the freedom that surrounded her. The ceremony came to an end simply, but with deep meaning. Mara and Otavio were now husband and wife. They left the chapel hand in hand, ready to face whatever came their way, confident that together they could overcome any obstacle. As they walked out of the chapel, a light wind blew, and Mara looked up at the sky, feeling a peace she hadn't experienced for a long time. A new phase was beginning, and she knew that, alongside Otavio, she would have the life she so desired. Happiness was within her reach, and she was ready to embrace it. Mara and Otavio believed that by marrying in secret, they would be safe from Elio's control for a while. However, the tranquility they felt after the ceremony was short-lived. Just 2 days after the wedding, the news reached Helio's ears. He was shocked to discover that his youngest daughter, whom he had always considered fragile and dependent, had married without his permission, and even worse, to a simple man, someone he despised for not belonging to the elite he valued so much. That night, Elio couldn't disguise his anger. He locked himself in his office for hours, calling his contacts, trying to find out where Mara and Otavio were. His mind was buzzing with indignation. For him, this was a personal betrayal, an affront to his power. How dare she defy him like that? How could his own daughter, even though she was the least liked, act so impulsively? While Elio sank into thoughts of revenge, Mara and Otavio enjoyed their first days as husband and wife. The small house they had rented in the village was modest but comfortable. For Mara, this was true luxury. Simplicity, the freedom to be who she was without judgment. She woke up next to Otavio every morning with the feeling that she was finally living the life she had always dreamed of. But the silence didn't last long. When Elio finally managed to find out where they were, he didn't hesitate. He went to the village himself, determined to confront them and bring Mara back home, whatever the cost. Elio had never been a man who accepted being contradicted, and this situation would be no different. Not only had he lost control over his daughter, but he also felt that his authority was being questioned. This was unacceptable to him. Later that afternoon, while Mara and Otavio were in the small garden of the house, Elio arrived. His luxury car stood out against the simple surroundings of the village, and the expression on his face was grim. When Mara saw him, her heart raced. She knew this moment would come, but she wasn't prepared to face it so soon. Elio got out of the car and walked towards them, his gaze fixed on Mara. "How could you do this to me?" he said, his voice full of anger and contempt. "Marry in secret? To that man? Have you gone mad?" Mara tried to remain calm, but Elio's presence made her feel small again. This was the man who had always despised her, who had never seen her as an equal to her sisters. And now he was there, furious, ready to take away the happiness she had finally found. "I did it because it's what I wanted," Mara replied, her voice shaky but firm. "I married Octavian because I love him, and you have no right to interfere in my life." Elio let out a bitter laugh. "Do you think you know what's best for you? You have no idea what you're doing. This man is only interested in what you have. He wants what's ours, what I built with my hard work." Octavian, until then silent, stepped forward. "I love your daughter, Helio," he said, trying to remain calm. "I don't care about your fortune or what you've built. I just want to be by Mara's side." But Elio didn't listen. He was blinded by anger. "You're a nobody," he said dismissively. a man of no importance. You're not worthy of my daughter. Mara felt her heart squeeze. Elio's words hurt her, but this time she wouldn't let them. I'm worthy of choosing my own life, she said, looking straight into her father's eyes. And I chose Otavio. We love each other, and nothing you say will change that. Mara's response made Helio lose his temper. He advanced towards her, his face red with anger. You're making the biggest mistake of your life, he shouted. I'll disinherit you. You'll have nothing. You'll live in misery, while your sisters continue to shine, just as I always wanted you to. The words echoed through the garden, and Mara felt a mixture of fear and sadness. She knew her father was capable of doing what he said, but for the first time, she felt she was willing to take the consequences. If that's what you want to do it, she said, her voice low but determined. I don't need your money. I don't need your name. I just need to be happy, and that's what I'm trying to do. Elio looked at her as if he didn't recognize her anymore. This was not the submissive daughter he knew. This was a determined woman who was willing to fight for her happiness, even if it meant giving up everything he had given her. For a brief moment, Helio hesitated. Perhaps, deep down, he knew he was losing something more valuable than his control over Mara. But pride spoke louder. He turned his back and walked back to the car without saying another word. Mara and Otavio watched in silence as he drove off, leaving behind a silent threat that hung in the air. Mara knew that this wasn't the end. Elio wouldn't give up so easily. But at that moment, she felt a strength she had never felt before. She was ready to face whatever came, as long as she was by Otavio's side. After the violent argument with Elio, Mara knew that the tranquility she and Otavio so desperately sought would be at risk. Her father was a man of power, used to controlling everything and everyone around him. He didn't accept being challenged, and Mara knew he wouldn't stand idly by after the humiliation of seeing her move on without his consent. In the days that followed, the silent threat that Elio had left in the air began to take shape. Mara and Otavio noticed small changes that gave them the feeling that something was wrong. House bills that had previously come in without any problems began to fall into arrears. Otavio, who had gotten a job in the village to ensure a modest income for the two of them, received the news that he was going to be fired. I'm sorry, said his boss, with an embarrassed expression, but I've received orders from above. There's nothing I can do. Otavio understood immediately. This was Helio's doing. He was using his influence to weaken them, a cruel tactic to force Mara to return home. Mara also realized what was happening and, although she tried not to show it, fear began to grow inside her. She knew that her father would do anything to separate them. But Otavio, no matter how difficult the situation, remained optimistic. We'll get through this, Mara, he said, holding her hand firmly. He may try to bring us down, but he won't succeed. We're in this together. Mara wanted to believe that. Otavio had always been her strength, her point of support when everything seemed to be falling apart. But at the same time, she knew how ruthless Elio was. He wouldn't accept seeing his daughter living a life he considered unworthy. You don't know my father like I do, she said in a whisper. He won't stop until he's destroyed everything we have. Otavio looked at her with determination. Then let's fight. We're not going to let him control our lives. Those words brought Mara some relief. She knew that Octavian was by her side, and that he would fight with her no matter what. Even so, the weight of uncertainty hung over them both. They were living in a fragile reality, and any move by Helio could destabilize them even more. As the weeks went by, the pressure increased. Every day, new difficulties arose. The little savings they had began to run out, and without Otavio's work, the situation became more complicated. Mara, however, was not ready to give up. Even without the financial support of her family, she knew that her emotional freedom was more important. She decided to look for work in the village, willing to do whatever it took to maintain the simple but happy life she had started to build with Otavio. One morning, Mara went out in search of a job. She went to various stores and interviews, and in each one she felt the weight of her surname. Are you Elio's daughter? They asked, curious but with a cautious tone. With every negative answer, Mara realized that her father's influence stretched far and wide. He was behind all those closing doors. Returning home, tired and discouraged, Mara found Otavio waiting for her. He welcomed her with a kind smile, but she couldn't hide her frustration. "He's suffocating us, Otavio," she said, her voice shaking. "No matter where I go, my father's name haunts me." Otavio hugged her, trying to convey all the reassurance he could. "We'll find a way out," he said, with conviction. Not everything can be controlled by him. But even as they spoke these words of encouragement to each other, they both knew that they were in a critical situation. Elio would not leave them alone until Mara surrendered, until she abandoned Otavio and returned to the life he had planned for her. Even so, Mara wasn't willing to go back. Her love for Otavio was what kept her going. He represented everything she had ever wanted. A simple life, free from the chains of appearances and status. With him, she was seen and loved for who she really was. And that, for Mara, was more valuable than any fortune or title Helio could offer. Over the next few days, the two of them continued to face difficulties. Life in the village was getting tighter and tighter, but even so, Mara and Otavio supported each other. They spent hours talking, planning for the future, dreaming of a time when they would be far from Helio's clutches. But deep down, Mara knew that something bigger was coming. Elio was not a man who gave up easily, and she felt that the calm they were trying to build was just the prelude to an even bigger storm. Otavio, on the other hand, continued to believe that, with perseverance and love, they would get through it all. That night, lying side by side, Mara looked at Otavio and whispered, "Whatever he tries, we won't give up." He looked into her eyes with the same determination as always and kissed her softly. "We're together, Mara. Nothing will keep us apart." But they both knew that the challenge they faced was immense. Their love was at risk, and Elio's actions were not over. The conflict between Mara and Elio continued to grow, but as time passed, something began to change inside Mara. She realized that she couldn't live forever in the shadow of her father's anger. Elio's actions, although cruel, seemed to reflect more than just his control. Mara began to see the truth behind his behavior. The fear of losing what he held most dear, power and control over those around him. Elio knew no other way to love than by imposing his dominance. And for the first time, Mara began to see the cracks in his armor. Elio wasn't just the ruthless man who tried to suffocate her. He was also someone who, deep down, was afraid. Afraid of losing what he had built. Afraid of losing his daughter. Afraid of losing himself. While these thoughts took hold of Mara, she and Otavio continued to struggle. Their financial situation was becoming increasingly complicated, and Elio's influence seemed to be spreading everywhere they tried to seek help. However, Mara was not willing to give in. She knew that in order to live in peace, she would have to face her father once and for all, not in anger, but with an open heart to try to understand the real reason for his resistance. One silent afternoon, Mara decided it was time to confront Elio again, but in a different way. It wouldn't be an argument, but a conversation. She needed him to know that, despite everything he had done, she was still his daughter, and she still wanted a relationship with him, but on new terms. The fear she carried inside needed to be put aside, and she wanted to give Elio the opportunity to do the same. Otavio supported her in this decision. "You're brave, Mara," he said, holding her hands. "I know this won't be easy, but I think you're right. Maybe it's the only way to break this cycle of control." Mara took a deep breath and, with the conviction that this was the right choice, went to Elio's house. She knew he hadn't expected to see her there, but something inside her told her that this was the moment. When she arrived, she was greeted with surprise. Elio didn't disguise his expression of astonishment when he saw her at the door. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "We need to talk, Dad," said Mara, firmly but without aggression. "I didn't come here to argue. I came to try to understand you. And I hope you'll try to understand me too." Elio hesitated, but let her in. The silence in the room was disconcerting, but Mara knew she had to start. "I know you didn't approve of my choices," she said, sitting down in a nearby chair. "And I understand that this has been difficult for you. But please try to see things from my point of view." Elio remained silent, but his eyes showed a restrained curiosity. He had never heard Mara speak so confidently and clearly about what she felt. I'm not like Letitia or Bruna, Mara continued. I never have been. But that doesn't mean I'm a disappointment. I just want to live my life the way I believe is right. And that doesn't mean I hate you or want to push you away. I want you to be part of my life, but not under the conditions you've always imposed. Elio took a deep breath, still visibly shaken. You've always been different, he said, almost in a whisper, and that scared me. I didn't know how to deal with you, Mara. I saw in Letitia and Bruna the continuity of what I believed was right. But you never followed that path. And that made me feel like I was losing control. Mara remained silent, allowing him to continue. I love you, Elio finally said, with a sincerity she had never heard before. But sometimes love gets confused with fear. And in my case, the fear of losing you made me act the wrong way. Mara felt a wave of emotion wash over her. For the first time, Elio was showing vulnerability, something she had never thought possible. She looked at him, not with anger, but with compassion. Dad, she said softly, you're not going to lose me. Not if you try to understand me, like I'm trying to understand you now. Elio looked away, clearly struggling with his own feelings. He had never allowed himself to be vulnerable, not even with his children. But now, standing there in front of Mara, he realized that his daughter was willing to forgive him, if he was willing to change. I don't know if I can change so quickly, he said, with a touch of sadness in his voice. But I'll try, Mara. For you. Mara smiled slightly, feeling a relief she hadn't known was possible. That's all I ask, she replied. I don't need you to agree with all my choices, but I just need you to respect me and accept that this is the life I've chosen. Elio nodded, still visibly moved. I'm going to try. And I want you to be happy, even if it means making choices I wouldn't have made. At that moment, Mara felt that, for the first time, she was beginning to rebuild her relationship with her father. Elio was still a difficult man, but he had taken the first step towards transformation. And for Mara, that was enough. After her conversation with Elio, something changed in Mara's life. Her relationship with her father, previously marked by tension and control, began to show signs of a slow transformation. Elio, although still a rigid man and resistant to change, had shown Mara that, deep down, he too wanted reconciliation, even if it meant revising his concepts. In the days that followed, Mara and Otavio continued to face the challenges of the simple life they had chosen, but now there was a sense of relief in the air. Otavio had found a new job in the village, and little by little they began to stabilize their finances. Mara felt that, for the first time in a long time, things were starting to move in a positive direction. Despite this, Mara knew that her relationship with Elio was still far from perfect. They kept in touch, but the relationship was delicate, as if any bad word could trigger a new wave of resentment. However, Mara was willing to continue working on this relationship with patience and perseverance. One day, while Mara and Otavio were walking through the village market, unexpected news reached them. Elio had decided to visit them. Mara was surprised. Ever since the confrontation, he had never shown any interest in visiting the house where she lived, let alone being near Otavio. Is he really changing? She thought, with a mixture of hope and apprehension. On the day of the visit, Mara felt her heart beat faster. Elio had always been an imposing figure in her life, and now he was about to enter a space that was hers and Otavio's alone. When Elio's car arrived at the villa, Mara felt her hands start to sweat. Everything's going to be fine, said Otavio, sensing her unease. He hugged her, and together they went to the door to welcome him. When Elio got out of the car, Mara noticed something different about his posture. He seemed less austere, less sure of himself, as if he were entering unknown territory. Thank you for seeing me, he said, his voice softer than usual. Mara greeted him, still a little tense, but trying to remain calm. I'm glad you came, she said, leading him inside. Otavio followed them, keeping a calm posture but on the lookout for any sign of conflict. The small house was simple but cozy. Elio looked around, as if trying to understand how his daughter, who had grown up in such luxury, could live in such a modest place. But instead of making disparaging remarks, he remained silent, observing. This is a very different place from what I imagined for you, he said at last. But It feels like home. Mara felt a knot form in her chest. That small gesture of recognition, however shy, was more than she had expected. It's home, she replied, with a smile. I feel at peace here. The conversation was light, without major confrontations, but full of subtexts. Elio was trying, and that, for Mara, was what mattered most. He stayed for dinner, something Mara never imagined would happen. The simplicity of the moment seemed to contrast sharply with the extravagant dinners that used to take place at the family mansion, but somehow that evening had a much greater meaning. During dinner, Elio took a closer look at Otavio. Until then, he had only seen him as an adversary, someone who had taken his daughter away from the path he had planned. But that evening, when he saw how Otavio looked after Mara, how he made her smile and how harmoniously the house ran, something changed in his perception. Elio, for the first time, began to see the value in Otavio not as a competitor, but as someone who really loved his daughter. After dinner, while Mara and Elio were alone on the balcony, he did something he had never done before. I made a mistake with you, Mara, he said, his voice deeper than usual. I tried to control you because I thought I knew better. But seeing you now, seeing how you've built your life, I realize I was wrong. Mara looked at him in surprise. She had never expected to hear those words from Elio. It was as if the impossible was happening before her eyes. Dad, I never wanted to push you away, she said sincerely. I just wanted you to really see me, to understand that I'm different, but that doesn't mean I'm less. I just want to be happy in my own way. Elio nodded, his eyes a little softer. I see that now, and even if I don't fully understand everything yet, I'm willing to try. Because, at the end of the day, you're my daughter. And if that's the life that makes you happy, I'll respect it. Mara felt tears gathering in her eyes. It was what she had always wanted to hear. She didn't need Elio to agree with all her choices, but the simple fact that he was willing to accept and respect her decisions was already a big step. Thank you, Dad, she said with emotion. That evening, as Elio set off back into his life, Mara and Otavio stood on the balcony, watching the car disappear down the road. Otavio smiled and hugged her. The impossible has happened, he said jokingly. Mara laughed, feeling a lightness she hadn't experienced for a long time. Yes, it happened, she replied. And, for the first time, I feel like we're all finally free.